Here's what nobody tells you about marrying a monster. The wolves don't stop circling just because the monster puts down his teeth. They circle closer. I married Luca Moretti on a Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen of my bakery, with flour in my hair and Nonna's rosary around my wrist, and a judge who looked like he was performing a ceremony at gunpoint. Which, to be fair, he sort of was. Dante stood behind us, with a glass of Prosecco, and the expression of a man watching two unstable chemicals being deliberately mixed. Marco wasn't there. My brother hadn't spoken to me since the wedding announcement. The brother whose hand Luca broke. The brother whose career Luca ended. The brother who didn't care that the risotto was poisoned. Who didn't care that Luca had broken his hand to save his life? Who only knew that the hand that used to carve roses out of radishes could barely hold a fork without trembling, and that his baby sister had married the man responsible. I didn't blame him. I understood the math. From the outside, the equation was simple. Monster breaks hand. Sister marries monster. It looked like Stockholm Syndrome, with a wedding ring. But love is not math. Love is cooking. It's imprecise and messy, and it requires heat and time and ingredients you didn't plan on using. And sometimes the thing that comes out of the oven is something you never would have imagined, and it's the best thing you've ever tasted. Luca Moretti was not a good man. He was not safe. He was not gentle in the ways the world expects gentleness. But he held espresso cups with both hands. He read Italian novels with dog-eared pages. He sat in my bakery every morning and unplugged from the empire like a man surfacing for air. And when he told me the truth about the poisoned risotto at 2 a.m. over a pot of sauce, I saw the architecture of his prison, the machine that required him to be a monster so the people around him could live. I chose him, not because he saved my brother's life, not because he gave up his territory for me. I chose him because he was the first person who saw past the flour and the cannoli and the self-deprecating jokes to the hunger underneath. He was the first person who looked at me, all of me, every curve, every scar, every 3 a.m. panic bake, and wanted the whole recipe, not just the parts that looked good in the display case. That's why I stayed. Now the wolves were at the door, and I was going to feed them. They came for my bakery at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, while I was elbow-deep in my grandmother's bread dough, and the most powerful man in the city was asleep upstairs with flour on his pillow. The dough was not cooperating. I'd been working it for 40 minutes. Nonna's ciabatta recipe, the one with the long ferment and the olive oil folded in at the last moment, the one she used to say required the patience of a saint and the arms of a fisherman's wife. The dough was supposed to be elastic and smooth. It was sticky and hostile. It clung to my fingers like it held a grudge. I was wearing my burgundy dress under a flour-dusted apron. My dark hair was pinned up in a messy twist, and I had a smear of bread flour on my left cheekbone that I wouldn't discover until morning. The bakery was warm, quiet, mine. Pendant lamps cast amber pools across the marble counter. The display case glowed softly, empty now, waiting for the morning's pastries. The chalkboard menu listed tomorrow's specials in my handwriting: chocolate-dipped cannoli, pistachio biscotti, Nonna's almond cookies. This was the hour I loved most. 3 a.m., the city asleep, the ovens warming. The smell of yeast and flour, and the faint ghost of cinnamon from yesterday's pastry cream. This was the hour when I could pretend the world outside my bakery didn't exist. When I could pretend I wasn't the wife of the most feared man in the city. When I could pretend the Calabrese family hadn't been circling for 3 months, like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. 3 months since the wedding. 3 months of Luca Moretti living above a bakery instead of in an estate, sleeping in a bed that was too small for his bodybuilder frame, waking up every morning with flour on his pillow because I baked at 3 a.m. and my hands were never completely clean. 3 months of him reading Pirandello in the corner booth while I shaped cornetti and pretended I wasn't watching him over the display case. 3 months of building a life in the narrow, beautiful, fragile space between a bakery counter and a mafia empire that was hemorrhaging territory. The blood was Luca's. He'd given up the ports, the unions, the territories, everything the Calabrese family had demanded to keep me alive. He'd traded half his empire for one plus-size baker with flour under her nails and a Sicilian temper that should have come with a warning label. In the criminal underworld, this was not seen as romantic. It was seen as weakness. And weakness, in Luca Moretti's world, was an invitation. Dante had told me, in his dry, knowing way, that there was a betting pool among the remaining Moretti captains on how long before someone made a move. The over-under was 6 months. The smart money was on 4. We were at 3 months and 12 days. I was thinking about the almond flour. Was it fresh enough? I'd been meaning to order more from that supplier in Agrigento, the one Nonna used to swear by, the one who hand-milled the almonds and shipped them in cloth bags that smelled like the orchards, when headlights cut through the front window. 3 black SUVs pulled up outside Russo's bakery like a funeral procession looking for a venue. The headlights were surgical, cutting through the dark street with the precision of spotlights at a crime scene. My hands stopped in the dough. I didn't scream. I didn't freeze. I wiped my hands on my apron, reached under the counter for the phone Luca had given me, the encrypted one, the one that connected directly to Dante's security network, and I pressed the emergency button. Then I pulled the bread dough off the marble, set it in the proving basket, covered it with a damp cloth, and squared my shoulders. A baker protects her kitchen. The front door of the bakery opened. The bell above it, a brass bell Nonna had hung 40 years ago, chimed its cheerful, oblivious little ring. 3 men entered. Dark suits, no ties. The practiced, unhurried walk of professionals who didn't need to rush because they knew nobody was going to stop them. Behind them, standing in the open doorway with the night air at his back, was Salvatore Calabrese. He was younger than I expected, 32, maybe 33. Lean the way a knife is lean, with sharp features and a mouth that curved into a smile, designed specifically to make people feel like prey. His dark hair was slicked back. His suit was more expensive than my bakery's quarterly revenue. He looked around the bakery, the way a landlord inspects a property he's about to condemn. His eyes swept the display case, the chalkboard menu, the family photographs on the wall, the flour-dusted counter, where my dough was proving. Then he picked up a cannoli from the display case. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, like a food critic at a restaurant that had offended him. "Not bad," Salvatore said. He smiled. "Your husband gave up his empire for a baker. I want to taste what's worth an empire." "The bakery's closed," I said. My voice was calm. My hands, hidden behind the counter, were shaking. "Come back at 7. I'll make you something fresh." The stairs behind the bakery creaked. Luca came down the staircase like a natural disaster in a dress shirt, barefoot, the white shirt pulled on in haste, unbuttoned, hanging open to reveal the powerful V-shaped torso that I'd memorized with my hands in the dark. Every muscle was defined by the warm bakery light. His dark hair was disheveled. His eyes, those intense, shifting dark eyes that ran the spectrum from brown to black, depending on who was about to have a very bad evening, were volcanic. He didn't run. Luca Moretti didn't run. He moved with the controlled, lethal precision of a man who had been trained since childhood to walk into rooms where people wanted to kill him. He stood behind me. His hand found the small of my back. The touch was brief, firm, and absolute. A man establishing, without words, that the woman in front of him was protected by everything he was capable of. "Salvatore," Luca said. His voice was the low, grinding sound of tectonic plates shifting. "You're in my wife's bakery." "Your wife's bakery," Salvatore repeated, tasting the words the way he'd tasted the cannoli. "You used to own ports. Now you own a pastry shop." "I own a bakery," I corrected. "A pastry shop is French. We're Sicilian. There's a difference." Dante appeared from somewhere. He had a supernatural talent for materializing in rooms, During the exact moment, his presence was most needed and most irritating. He wore a full suit at 3 a.m. because Dante Ferro did not acknowledge the concept of off-duty hours. "Salvatore," Dante said mildly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I see you've brought your men to a bakery. I assume this is a very aggressive pastry order." Salvatore's smile sharpened. He set down the half-eaten cannoli on my counter, on the marble that Nonna had hand-selected, on the surface where I had kneaded 1,000 loaves of bread, and he looked directly at Luca. "My father was patient with you, Moretti. He accepted your territory, your ports, your surrender. But patience is a finite resource, and I am not my father." "Clearly," Luca said, "your father had the courtesy to call before visiting. I'm calling now. You have the 5 families' dinner in 2 weeks. The annual meeting, the one where the dons agree on territories and trade, and the polite fiction that we're all civilized. I'm aware of the dinner. I want the remaining Moretti territory, all of it, the restaurants, the construction contracts, the political connections. Everything." Salvatore paused. "Or I will dismantle your wife's bakery, brick by brick, starting with the oven her grandmother used." The silence that followed was the sound of a man calculating how quickly he could dismantle another human being with his bare hands. I put my hand on Luca's forearm. His muscles were concrete beneath my fingers. I squeezed. Twice. Our code. The same code Marco and I had used since we were children. "I'm here." "Get out of my bakery," I said to Salvatore Calabrese. My voice didn't shake. My hands had stopped trembling. "I have bread to bake." Salvatore looked at me with an expression I recognized, the particular confusion of a powerful man confronted with a woman who refused to cower. Then he laughed, turned on his heel, and walked out. His men followed. The brass bell chimed as the door closed. The bakery was quiet. The dough in the proving basket had been quietly, obediently rising throughout the entire confrontation. Because bread does not care about power dynamics. Bread cares about yeast, and time, and temperature, and nothing else. I envied the bread. Luca exhaled. The sound was volcanic, compressed, controlled, but carrying the pressure of a man who had just been told his entire remaining legacy would be demolished, along with his wife's grandmother's oven. He turned to me. His massive hands, the hands that had broken my brother's bones and held my face like it was made of spun sugar, were shaking. "Gianna," he said. His voice was raw. "I can end this. Tonight. I still have men. I still have resources. Give me 12 hours, and Salvatore Calabrese will not be a problem." I looked at him. I looked at this man who stood barefoot in my bakery at 3 a.m., his white shirt open, his chest heaving, offering to burn down the world to protect my oven. I looked at the boy who had woken up to the smell of his mother's sauce and lost her in a kitchen and spent 19 years trying to make sure nobody else lost theirs. "No," I said. "Gianna, I didn't marry you so you could keep being the version of yourself that solves problems with broken bones. I married you because I saw the other version. The one who holds espresso cups with both hands and reads Pirandello with dog-eared pages and falls asleep with flour on his pillow." I placed my flour-covered hand on his chest. His heart was hammering. "We're not fighting this war with fists, Luca. We're fighting it with food." He stared at me. His dark eyes searched my face with the intensity of a man trying to understand an equation that defied every law of physics he'd ever known. "With food," he repeated flatly. "With food. You want to defeat the most dangerous man in the 5 families. With dinner." "I want to defeat the most dangerous man in the 5 families with my grandmother's dinner. There's a significant difference." Dante, who had been quietly observing this exchange with the serene expression of a man watching his thesis being confirmed in real time, cleared his throat. "If I may," Dante said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "while Gianna's approach is admirable, It would be considerably more effective if accompanied by evidence that Salvatore Calabrese personally orchestrated the poisoning at the original Calabrese dinner. Evidence that I have been quietly gathering for 14 months. Luca and I both turned to look at him. "You've had evidence for 14 months, Luca said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you didn't tell me?" "I was waiting for the correct moment," Dante said. "Timing, in matters of justice, is everything. Also, I wanted to see if Gianna would figure out the food angle on her own, which she did, confirming my assessment that she is the most strategically gifted person in this organization, despite having no formal training in anything except pastry." I would have hugged Dante, but Dante did not permit physical contact outside of a precisely calibrated handshake. I settled for pointing at him with a flour-covered finger and saying, "You're getting the biggest cannoli I've ever made." "I prefer biscotti," Dante said, "but I accept the sentiment." The next 14 days were a war conducted entirely in flour. Marco showed up at my bakery on a Saturday morning. I hadn't seen him in 4 months. He stood in the doorway, lean, dark-haired, wearing chef's whites that looked too clean, like they'd been put on for the first time in a long time, and he didn't come in. He just stood there. His right hand hung at his side. The scars on his knuckles were visible, raised and white against his olive skin. The hand that had taught me to fold pasta at 9 years old. The hand that had carved radishes into roses. The hand that Luca had broken to save his life. "Are you going to stand there all day?" I asked. "You're blocking the entrance. I have customers." "You have 4 customers, G, and one of them is a cat. Mr. Whiskers is a loyal patron. He tips in dead birds." Marco almost smiled. Almost. The expression flickered across his face, like a pilot light trying to catch, then died. He walked in. He crossed the bakery floor, past the display case, past the chalkboard menu, past the photograph of Nonna that hung above the register, and he stopped at the marble counter. He placed his scarred right hand flat on the surface. He flexed his fingers. The index and middle finger moved normally. The ring finger trembled. The pinky barely bent. Then he picked up a chef's knife with his left hand. He gripped it awkwardly, his fingers finding unfamiliar positions on the handle, his wrist turning at an angle that would have made Nonna weep. "Teach me again," Marco said. His voice cracked on the word again. From the beginning. I stared at my brother, at his damaged hand on the counter, and his good hand gripping a knife like a child gripping a crayon. At the pride that had kept him away for 4 months, and the desperation that had brought him back. I walked around the counter. I stood beside him. I placed my hand over his on the knife handle, adjusting his grip, the way I'd adjusted hundreds of students' grips in the community cooking classes I'd taught before all of this. "Your wrist is too tight," I said. "Let the knife do the work. You're not fighting the onion. You're negotiating with it. You sound like Nonna. Nonna would have made you chop with your teeth if that's what it took." Marco laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd heard from him since before the hospital. The sound cracked something open inside my chest, a fissure I'd been ignoring for months, and suddenly my eyes were burning, and the knife was blurry, and my brother was crying too, and we were both standing in Nonna's bakery, with tears running down our faces, holding a knife neither of us could see. "I don't forgive him," Marco said quietly. "I know, but I forgive you." I pulled him into a hug. He was taller than me, but he folded into my arms the way he used to when we were kids, when I was the little sister who baked cookies when he was sad, when the world was small enough to fit inside a kitchen. "Help me cook the dinner," I said, pulling back, wiping my face with my flour-covered hands, leaving streaks of white on my cheeks. "The 5 families' dinner. I need a sous chef." Marco looked at his damaged hand. He looked at the knife in his left hand. He looked at me. "I can't cook like I used to, G. Nobody's asking you to cook like you used to. I'm asking you to cook like you will." I cooked for 48 hours straight. Not for a deal, not for diplomacy. I cooked because the 5 families were coming, and a woman with nothing left to lose cooks like she means it. Luca offered the Moretti estate kitchen. I declined. The dinner would be at the estate, but the food, my food, would be prepared at Russo's bakery and transported in Dante's temperature-controlled vehicles because Dante, bless his obsessive organizational soul, had thought of everything, including how to maintain the structural integrity of a chocolate soufflé during a 15-minute car ride. I made Nonna's recipes, not because they were the best recipes in the world, although they were, and I will fight anyone who disagrees, including that food blogger who once called traditional Sicilian cooking rustic, a word I have never forgiven. But because they were mine. They were my grandmother's hands in mine. They were the unbroken chain of Sicilian women who had fed families and survived wars and fled poverty and crossed oceans and kept the world turning with olive oil and stubbornness and the absolute, bone-deep conviction that a properly made sauce could fix anything. I made the bread first. Always the bread first. Nonna's rule. The bread tells you whether the kitchen is worthy, she used to say. If the bread fails, send everyone home. Ciabatta, with the 3-day ferment, the starter that I'd been feeding like a pet since I was 16, the crust shattering under pressure to reveal the soft, elastic, pocketed interior that exhaled steam when you tore it. Rosemary focaccia with Maldon salt and olive oil from the estate's own groves. Luca had brought me a bottle, dark green, pressed from trees his mother had planted 30 years ago. I used it without telling him. Some gifts are better when they're invisible. The oil was fruity and peppery, and tasted like the sun-warmed hillside, where a dead woman had once tended trees for a family that would eventually break everything she loved. Grissini thin as pencils, with a twist, because Nonna said straight breadsticks were lazy and German. The antipasto, burrata from a dairy in Puglia, that Dante had somehow sourced at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. He refused to tell me how, which meant either bribery or blackmail, and with Dante, both were equally likely. The burrata was so fresh, it wept cream when I cut into it. Heirloom tomatoes from the estate garden, red and orange and striped green, sliced thick. Basil torn by hand, never cut, never. Nonna would rise from the grave, and the grave would not be deep enough, drizzled with that olive oil. The simplicity was the point. You can't hide behind complexity when the ingredients are this honest. The dish either sings or it confesses. The primo, hand-cut pappardelle with a lamb ragout that had been braising since dawn. I'd started the sauce at 5 a.m., searing the lamb shanks until they were mahogany, building the sofrito from onion, carrot, celery, minced fine, sweated slow, patient, unhurried. The wine went in next, a Nero Diavola that cost more than my rent, because Luca had opinions about cooking wine that I privately found endearing and outwardly found insufferable. The sauce reduced for 6 hours until it clung to the pasta the way a secret clings to the person who's keeping it, tightly, desperately, refusing to let go. I added a whisper of cinnamon, the way Nonna did, because Nonna believed cinnamon in a savory sauce was what separated Italian cooking from everyone else's. The French use butter, she'd say. We use thyme, and cinnamon, and prayer. The secondo, veal ossobuco. The marrow bones from a butcher in Little Italy who had known Nonna for 40 years and still set aside the best cuts for Marco's sister, the one with the bakery. The gremolata, lemon zest, parsley, garlic, made fresh, the colors bright as paint on a palette. Marco worked beside me. Left-handed, slower than before, his movements careful and deliberate where they used to be fluid and instinctive. He julienned vegetables at half the speed he once had, but the cuts were clean. He stirred the risotto, the irony was not lost on either of us, with a steady hand. When the cream sauce needed finishing, he used his right hand to hold the pan and his left to swirl the butter, and the movement was new and awkward and beautiful in the way all rebuilt things are beautiful. "You're putting too much salt," Marco said, watching me season the veal. I'm putting exactly the right amount of salt. Nonna would disagree. Nonna undersalted everything, and you know it. The woman survived the war on rationing and never emotionally recovered. Marco grinned. She'd slap you for that. She'd slap me, taste the veal, and then quietly add more salt when nobody was looking. The dolce was Nonna's tiramisu, the recipe she'd whispered to me. Mascarpone, not ricotta, espresso-soaked ladyfingers, cocoa powder dusted on top like volcanic ash. The same tiramisu that had cracked Luca Moretti open at the first Calabrese dinner. The same tiramisu that a viewer from the comments had made someone want to run out and buy. The recipe was mine. The memory was everyone's. The Moretti estate dining room was dressed for war disguised as dinner. Crystal on white linen. Candles in silver holders. The long mahogany table polished to a mirror finish. 22 place settings. 5 dons. Their consiglieri, their senior captains, and one plus-size baker's wife standing in the kitchen doorway with cocoa powder on her forearms and the fate of an empire in her tiramisu. The 5 dons sat at the table, Luca at the head, in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his jaw a straight line, his dark eyes scanning the room with the calculated attention of a chess player seeing 12 moves ahead. Salvatore Calabrese sat directly across from him, wearing the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. The other 3 dons, Ricci, Benedetti, De Luca, sat between them like referees at a boxing match, their faces carefully neutral, their loyalties carefully uncommitted. Salvatore leaned back in his chair. A beautiful table, Moretti, but the question remains. My terms, your remaining territory, tonight. Luca didn't respond immediately. He lifted his wine glass, swirled it once, and took a measured sip. The pause was deliberate. It was the silence of a man who had learned that the most terrifying word in any language is the one you don't say. The food first, Luca said. My wife has been cooking for 2 days. Your wife, Salvatore said, and the word carried a disdain that made my blood heat, is a baker. My wife, Luca replied, his voice dropping into the register that I privately called the frequency of someone about to have a very bad week, is the reason you're eating tonight, instead of negotiating over cold sandwiches. Show some respect. I served the courses myself. I carried the platters from the kitchen and set them on the table with the same focused, confident energy I brought to every meal. I was not a servant. I was not decoration. I was the chef, and in a kitchen, the chef outranks everyone, including the don. The bread landed first. The focaccia disappeared in 90 seconds. Don Ricci, a heavy-set man with white hair and the appetite of a man who remembered hunger, asked for a second basket. I sent Marco out with one. Marco entered the dining room, carrying bread in his scarred hands. He walked past Luca, without looking at him. He set the basket on the table. He walked back. The room noticed. The room noticed everything. The pappardelle silenced the table the way only extraordinary food can. 22 powerful men, accustomed to violence and negotiation and the constant calculation of advantage, stopped talking and ate. The lamb ragout with the whisper of cinnamon coated the hand-cut pasta, and for 3 minutes, the dining room of the most dangerous family in the city sounded like nothing but the quiet, reverent scrape of forks on china. I carried the tiramisu to the table myself. I set it in front of Salvatore Calabrese. This is my grandmother's recipe, I said, looking down at the man who wanted to destroy my bakery. She taught me that some dishes are too good for men, but she made them anyway, because she believed that feeding someone was the closest thing to forgiveness. Salvatore looked up at me. For the first time since 3 a.m. in my bakery, his expression was not smug. It was uncertain. A man who trades in violence and territory does not have a protocol for a woman who feeds him her grandmother's secrets. He tasted the tiramisu. He closed his eyes, and I saw it, the same fault line crack I'd seen on Luca's face at the first Calabrese dinner. the mascarpone and espresso reaching through the armor, past the cruelty, into the place where even monsters keep their mother's memories. My grandmother, Salvatore said quietly, made something like this. Most grandmothers did, I said. That's the point. The dinner was not about food. It never was. Food was the table. The real meal was information. Dante stood up from his chair at the far end of the table. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a single photograph. He placed it face up on the white linen tablecloth, precisely centered, directly in Salvatore Calabrese's line of sight. The man in this photograph, Dante said, his voice carrying the calm, measured tone of a professor delivering a lecture to students who were about to fail, is Marco Ferrante, former sous chef at the Moretti estate. He was the mole who poisoned the risotto at the first Calabrese dinner 18 months ago. The poison was oleander extract, enough to kill everyone at the table. The room went silent. Marco Ferrante is currently employed, Dante continued, as a personal aide in your entourage, Salvatore. He has been for 14 months. Salvatore's face went white. Not the white of innocence, the white of a man who has just discovered that the bomb he thought was under someone else's chair has been under his own the entire time. Your father, Luca said, and his voice was no longer the grinding of tectonic plates. It was the quiet, absolute calm of a man holding a checkmate, didn't order the poisoning. We know that. Don Calabrese was a man of honor. The dinner was meant to prevent a war, not start one. Luca leaned forward. The candlelight caught the scar above his eyebrow. But you did, Salvatore. You planted the mole. You poisoned the risotto. You wanted the dinner to fail, so your father would go to war. And when he didn't, you waited. You waited for your father to grow old. And when he did, you took his chair and came after me with the leverage you manufactured from your own sabotage. The three neutral dons turned to Salvatore. Their expressions were no longer neutral. I broke a chef's hand to save everyone at that table, Luca said, including your father. And you used the chaos you created to convince the families that I was a violent animal who needed to be contained. He reached across the table and turned the photograph so every don could see it. The animal at this table, Luca said, is not the man who broke the hand. It's the man who poisoned the plate. Salvatore opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a man choking on a rebuttal that couldn't survive contact with the truth. Don Ricci spoke. His voice was a low rumble. Is this verified, Dante? Dante produced a folder. Financial records linking Salvatore's private account to Marco Ferrante's payments. Communication logs and a signed confession from Ferrante himself, obtained this morning. Obtained how? Salvatore demanded, his composure finally cracking. I asked politely, Dante said. I can be very polite. The vote was quick. The three neutral dons sided with Luca. Salvatore's territory, including the ports, the unions, everything Luca had surrendered, was returned to the Moretti family. Salvatore Calabrese was stripped of his position. His father's legacy would be managed by a council until a suitable successor was found. Salvatore stood up. He looked at Luca with an expression of pure, undiluted hatred. Then he looked at me. The baker, he said, his voice dripping with venom. You let a baker fight your war. Luca smiled. The smile was rare and devastating, a weapon he almost never used. She didn't fight my war, Luca said. She won hers. I just held the door. I drove back to the bakery at 1 a.m. Not to the estate, to the bakery, because some things need to end where they began. The kitchen was still warm. The proving baskets were where I'd left them. The dough had risen, doubled in size, pressing against the cloth like something alive demanding to be born. I put on my apron. I took out the dough. I began to shape the morning's ciabatta. The brass bell chimed. Luca walked in. He'd taken off his suit jacket. His tie was gone. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked exhausted and relieved, and something else. Something I'd been catching in glimpses for months, and could finally see clearly. He sat in his usual booth, the corner one, with the view of the counter. "I don't have espresso ready," I said. "I didn't come for espresso." "What did you come for?" "The baker." I kept shaping the bread. My hands moved through the dough, folding, stretching, turning. The rhythm was ancient, inherited, instinctive, Nonna's hands in mine. "Marco stayed to clean the kitchen at the estate," I said. "He washed every pot. He organized the pantry. He spent 20 minutes sharpening the knives left-handed." Luca was quiet. "He's going to come back," I said, "to the bakery. Every morning, he's going to learn to cook again. Left-handed. From the beginning." "Good. He still doesn't forgive you." "He shouldn't. He forgave me, though." Luca looked at me across the bakery. The warm light caught the angles of his face, the dark intensity of his eyes, the silver that would someday thread through his hair, the way it threaded through Dante's. "Gianna," he said, "Luca, your tiramisu changed the balance of power among the 5 most dangerous families in the country. It's the mascarpone." "Ricotta could never." He stood up. He walked behind the counter. He stood beside me, his massive frame dwarfing the workspace, his heat warming the air between us. He looked down at my hands in the dough. Then he reached across the counter. His scarred hand found mine, the hand that shattered things, holding the hand that built them. His calloused fingers interlaced with my flour-covered ones, and I felt the same earthquake I'd felt the first time he'd touched me. The full-body shudder, the tectonic shift, the rearrangement of everything I thought I knew about monsters and bakers, and the improbable alchemy of the two. "I chose you over the Empire," Luca said quietly. "And tonight, the Empire came back because of you. It came back because Dante is terrifyingly competent, and your tiramisu game needed work." He almost smiled. Almost. The expression flickered across his face like a pilot light catching, and this time, it held. "The bread needs to prove for another hour," I said. "I know. And I need to make the morning's pastries. I know. And Mr. Whiskers is going to want his saucer of cream at 6. The cat can wait." He kissed me. Gently. Which was not a word anyone in the 5 families would associate with Luca Moretti. He kissed me in the warm, flour-dusted kitchen of Russo's bakery, with Nonna's photograph watching from the wall, and the bread proving in its basket, and the first grey light of dawn turning the windows silver. And for 30 quiet minutes, the Empire stopped. Here's what they don't tell you about the wolves at the bakery door. They don't tell you that the wolves are afraid of fire. They don't tell you that the most dangerous weapon in a kitchen isn't a knife. It's a grandmother's recipe, written on a card, so old the ink has faded, made with hands so practiced, they don't need to read the measurements anymore. They don't tell you that feeding someone is the most subversive act of power in existence, because you cannot hate a woman who has fed you the best meal of your life. Salvatore Calabrese came to my bakery to take everything I had. He left with nothing but the taste of my grandmother's tiramisu and the memory of a woman who didn't blink. Luca Moretti gave up an empire for a baker. The empire came back. The baker stayed, and every morning, at 6 a.m., the most feared man in the city sits in a corner booth of a small bakery with an espresso and a cannoli, and he reads his Italian novels with their dog-eared pages, and he watches his wife shape the morning's bread with the same focused, fascinated attention he gave me the first time he watched me cook. Like I was the most confusing thing he'd ever encountered. More confusing than a rival family. More dangerous than a loaded gun. Marco comes in at 7. He pushes through the bakery door with his shoulder, because his right hand is usually carrying a bag of produce from the market. Tomatoes, basil, whatever caught his eye. He's slower than he used to be. His right hand still trembles on the bad days, and there are mornings when he drops things and his jaw goes tight, and I can see the ghost of the old fury rising behind his eyes. But he's cooking again. Left-handed, patient, rebuilding himself one cut, one stir, one fold at a time. He started a community cooking class on Saturday mornings. Free, open to anyone. Neighborhood kids, mostly. 12-year-olds and 15-year-olds who live in apartments without proper kitchens, who eat fast food because nobody ever showed them what real food tasted like. He teaches them to make fresh pasta with their hands. He teaches them to chop onions without crying, which is a lie, because everyone cries. But the lesson is really about learning to keep going while your eyes burn. He teaches them Nonna's recipes, the ones she whispered, the ones she wrote on cards with faded ink, the unbroken chain. Marco still hasn't forgiven Luca. I'm not sure he ever will. Forgiveness is not a recipe. You can't force it to rise on a timeline, and you can't fold it in at the last minute and hope it holds. But he eats breakfast at the bakery every morning, and sometimes, when Luca is reading his Pirandello in the corner and Marco is kneading dough at the counter, they exist in the same space, without violence, without accusation, without the 9-year-old wound between them demanding attention. They just exist, and I hope, that's a kind of peace that forgiveness might eventually grow from, the way bread rises if you give it warmth and time and the patience of a saint. Nonna would understand. Nonna, who survived the war on rationing and never emotionally recovered, who crossed an ocean with nothing but a suitcase and a recipe box, who built a bakery in a foreign country and fed strangers until they became family. Nonna would look at the three of us in this kitchen and say what she always said when things were broken, but not beyond repair. Mangia. Eat. The bread is warm and the world is cold, and we are together. That is enough. Some women marry princes. Some women marry monsters. I married a man who was both, and I discovered that the only way to survive the fairy tale is to be the one holding the knife and the spoon. My name is Gianna Russo Moretti. I'm 29 years old, plus size, curvy, and the owner of a bakery that once brought the 5 most dangerous families in the country to their knees with a plate of tiramisu. And if you think this story is over, you haven't tasted the cannoli yet. Hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what's the recipe your grandmother taught you? What's the dish that connects you to the people you love? I want to hear every single one. And if you want to know what happens when Salvatore Calabrese comes back, and he will, make sure that notification bell is on, because the wolves never stop circling, but neither do the bakers. I'll see you in the next story.